Paraguay has transformed itself in just a few years. This is a transformation that is very much visible in the rising skyline of its capital, Asunción. But it is also something that is apparent when looking at the many changes introduced in the country's regulatory framework. The government is pleased with the results, but how do international observers rate these efforts? In this last chapter of our Viewpoint on Paraguay, I'll be speaking to the IMF local representative, Alejandro Santos, to find out. Let's go and meet with him. Paraguay's maquila and construction sectors are soaking up growing volumes of foreign direct investment, according to the IMF. This is thanks to the country's abundant and inexpensive labor and energy, as well as to its favorable tax system. Further, recent legislation and policy frameworks have improved fiscal and monetary responsibility, government transparency, and updated banking rules. Will these reforms keep Paraguay on its development track?
I think it's going very well. I think these reforms are very needed. It's part of a process that began a decade ago when Paraguay started a program with the IMF and embraced a number of reforms that now have been culminating with having new frameworks on the conduct of monetary and fiscal policy. In the monetary side, they have now a new inflation targeting framework in which they set the target for inflation at 4.5%, plus minus 2. And on the fiscal side, they have a new framework, which is the Fiscal Responsibility Law, with a target of 1.5% of GDP deficit, which they have accomplished. So we're very pleased to see that what began as an IMF program 10 years ago is moving ahead with new reforms, and that the country is finally growing, because from the early 80s to the early 2000s, the economy was in a period of very, very low growth, almost a stagnation, and with a lot of instability. So now we have a thriving economy, a growing growing at a time when the external environment is not the best for them, and where they have embraced all these reforms. In particular, the law that you mentioned on the banking, it's important and timely because it also is trying to modernize the framework that they have for supervising and for monitoring the banks.
So you mentioned a move from a period of stagnation to very high growth, with peaks in 2010 and 2013, where GDP growth went to double digit. And now the focus for this year is again above average for Latin America. So there is quite a lot of upsides in the economy, also lots of need for investments, particularly in infrastructure. So the PPP law that was introduced a couple of years ago should go in that direction. But how do you assess the success of this law and what needs to be done in the future?
Well, you mentioned the PPPs. I think the PPP legislation is very important because there's a bit of tension with having a relatively low level of deficit in the fiscal responsibility law, which limits the kind of the amount of expenditure you can have for public works. When you have a PPP law, that somehow allows the private sector to complement some of the work that the public sector is trying to accomplish and try to get the kind of infrastructure that is needed for the country. So I think it's a very timely kind of legislation, and they're still at an early stage trying to see how they can be implementing this legislation, but there are plenty of projects that can be used for this purpose.
Now, lastly, when looking at Paraguay, it would be fair to say that a lot of people wouldn't even be able to place it on the map. So there is a bit of a knowledge gap, perhaps.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of discovery that the rest of the world is doing on Paraguay. Paraguay is an up-and-coming country that, as you mentioned before, is growing way above the average for the region, and is doing under difficult conditions. I mean, the situation in Brazil is not the best, the terms of trade are not the best, and yet they managed to grow at a much higher rate than the rest of the region. So I think investors all over the world are discovering Paraguay, and there's a lot of opportunities here. There's a lot of energy, electricity is abundant, the frameworks are there for foreign investment. The rule of law is being respected, contracts are being enforced, and I think there's a lot of potential. So investors are more than welcome to explore Paraguay and to invest because there's a bright future ahead for them.
And what would you say to investors who do know Paraguay that also came across perception indices about transparency, corruption, which are not too hopeful?
Well, I think Paraguay has made a lot of progress in improving these indices. Some of them are indices of perception, and it's really the population evaluating their own government, how they perceive the government, and perhaps some people are a bit harsh with their own government. I don't see a major difference with any other Latin American country, and the fact is that there are a lot of foreign investors here operating, and they have successfully operated here, and they have made significant profit. So I don't see that as a problem because the authorities are addressing it, and investors are coming, and they are successful.
Very good. Thank you, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Silvia. My pleasure.